Okay, so chapter 2 starts the very next day, and Tom and Nick are going to go into New York City, but really Tom just wants to introduce his girlfriend Myrtle. And this is really the first time we see this place, but it's an important place to the story. They go into New York City, but before they get there, they go to a place called the Valley of Ashes. So if you'd see a map of New York City, you'd have the city far off to the west. You would have Long Island a little bit southeast of there, and right in between would be basically where the Bronx is. And this is kind of a rundown, poor part of town. So we realized right away Tom's girlfriend doesn't have a lot of money, and she lives in kind of like the rough area of New York City. So they approach this place, they get out of the car, and the first thing Nick sees is this big, it's a famous scene, it's this big billboard with these two huge eyes right on top of it. And Nick kind of thinks it's weird. He sees it's an advertisement for an optometrist, and it says Dr. T.J. Eckleburg. And Nick says, I've never seen an advertisement so strange. And as they're walking in, he's like, it was almost like the eyes of God, up in the sky looking down. So you'll notice this is going to be an important symbol for the book. You can see, of course, I have this terrible illustration, but these eyes are going to represent, kind of religion looking down on this valley. And anything that's immoral that happens, it's almost like God's watching. I also think it's kind of a good point. Fitzgerald, of course, describes the advertisement as being faded, and looking back at the 20s, religion was faded. So it's kind of this, funny little symbolism. So that's kind of the start of chapter 2, and then all of a sudden we see George Wilson approaching Nick and Tom. And the very first impression we get of this guy is he is very poor. You can tell he's a very hard worker. I mean, he owns his car garage. You can tell he's been working all morning, doesn't have a lot of money, and it's basically like right away, Tom just craps all over this guy. Doesn't give him the time of day, and you just instantly feel bad for Wilson. I mean, of course, his wife's having this affair and he has no idea. So the first impression of Wilson's interesting. And then Myrtle comes down the steps. And Nick is like totally shocked at the first impression of Myrtle. She is a little bit overweight. She's older. She's not really attractive. Like, it doesn't kind of fit with what he thought she'd look like. And he instantly starts thinking, why would Tom choose someone who is older and not very attractive? Like, it doesn't make sense. Why leave Daisy for somebody else? And to me, the more I've read this book, I kind of realize what Fitzgerald's doing here. Their relationship's going to represent the two American desires, power and money. She, of course, wants Tom's money, and he wants power over her. So he can basically, as we'll see later, do whatever he wants, and she's not going to leave him. So it's this interesting relationship. And they kind of go off to the corner, and they agree to meet in New York City an hour later. And of course she leaves, and Tom again just kind of blows past Wilson, and him and Nick leave. And as they leave, they drive into the city. It's about 20 more minutes, and they get there waiting for Myrtle. She approaches, and they get into the car. And the movie does it well, but it's a famous scene where they're in the car and her and Tom start kissing, and Nick's just like awkwardly in the middle. And they drive into towards what Tom shares. He has a secret apartment, and of course that's where him and Myrtle always go. So I think at this point Nick kind of gets, okay, I see what's going on here. So they go to his apartment, and on the street she sees a vendor who has this big basket of dogs, and she begs Tom, I want you to buy me a dog for the apartment. So he does, and you'll notice, like every chapter, I read this book, many times, and I didn't quite get it till a few years ago. Every chapter there's an allusion to a dog. And I kept thinking, why so many dogs in this book? Like Fitzgerald, it's all over the place. And I actually did a research paper on this in college. Dogs represent the 20s in America. I mean, people running around like crazy, acting wild, looking for affection, selfishness. And he's showing us, like, this is what these people act like. So, fittingly, she wants a dog. He buys one, and they go to the apartment. And as soon as they get there, The first thing Myrtle does is she changes clothes. She's like the ultimate gold digger. All she wants to do is appear to be rich, especially around Tom. So she, wears this great, nice dress. They get into the apartment, and she makes a phone call to her sister Catherine and this other couple who we haven't met yet, Mr. and Mrs. McKee. So they get to the apartment, and they have like this huge party. And Tom, of course, gets all this alcohol out. Everybody starts drinking and having a good time. And Nick admits to us, like, I've never really had a drink before, like maybe here or there, but not really. So like this is all new to him. And all of a sudden, Tom and Myrtle go by themselves into the bedroom, and you can assume what they're doing. So they're in the bedroom, and it's an interesting scene. Nick and Catherine start talking, and they start talking to each other about two different things. Number one, about how Myrtle and Tom met, which was interesting. Like, even Catherine kind of admits, they're kind of screwing over their spouses, and Tom, likes having a wife and having a girlfriend. So she admits it. But then number two, she asks Nick, like, where do you live? And he says, oh, I live in West Egg. And of course she says, you must know Gatsby. And he goes, I live by him, but I don't know. And she goes, he's very famous. He's a nephew of Kaiser Wilhelm. If you, of course, read this in the 20s, you'd know Kaiser Wilhelm was like the president of Germany during World War I. So this would be like a pretty big rumor. And whether or not it's true, we don't know. But this kind of leads into this whole mystery of Gatsby. So they talk about that. And then probably the most famous scene from chapter 2 occurs. The door busts open, and it is Tom and Myrtle like screaming in each other's face. And Myrtle keeps saying, I can say her name whenever I want to, and they're fighting about Daisy. And she gets in Tom's face and she goes, Daisy, Daisy, screaming at him. And of course, Tom, who is drunk, takes his fist and boom, clocks her in the face, punches her, breaks her nose. There's like blood everywhere. And Nick is just like, holy crap, like what just happened? And Myrtle's on the ground bleeding. And Tom's like standing over her. And like suddenly, like within a second, he like picks her up and apologizes. And the interesting thing is like she just forgives him. So clearly, two things. Number one, this probably happens all the time. But number two, it's almost like, what's she gonna do? She wants his money, she wants to be with him. So kind of the important scene of chapter 2, he punches her in the face. And Nick's like, I was kind of drunk at the time, but all I could see, it's a famous scene. They're all picking up magazine articles and wiping down the blood off the wall. So if you look at the end of chapter 2, that's an important scene. But Nick's like, I was so drunk that I couldn't really think straight, and it was like really late, and he said, I decided to leave. So without telling Tom and Myrtle, who are still kind of arguing, he leaves the apartment. And he leaves right at the end of chapter 2 with Mr. McKee, the other guy who was there. And probably the most controversial section of the book to this point, right at the end, him and McKee go in the elevator, they go downstairs, and then they go to Mr. McKee's apartment. And then there's this ... And Fitzgerald doesn't really tell us what's going on, but all of a sudden they're in bed together. And Nick is confused at what just happened. So like if you Google this, you would find tons of people's opinions. What happened at the end of chapter 2? Like, did Nick do something with Mr. McKee? Did he not? Like, was he just drunk? And like, to me, it doesn't really matter. I think this whole scene just represents Nick is a little bit out of his element. He's experiencing new stuff, and it's really just all new to him. So like you can kind of Google that on your own. You can find stuff on that. But remember that scene, it's important. And right at the end of chapter 2, Nick just randomly again wakes up, and he's in Penn Station, and it is like 5 in the morning, and he's like, what just happened? I don't know. So chapter 2 is a few important things. Remember the Valley of Ashes, where you meet Myrtle and George Wilson. We have this scene where Tom punches Myrtle, and then this scene at the end with Nick getting drunk and going home with Mr. McKee. But the interesting thing to me, we are through 2 chapters. Now, of course, there's only 9 chapters, so we are 20% of the way through the book. we have not met Gatsby yet. So that is going to be the main focus of chapter 3. Nick is finally going to meet Gatsby, and we're going to see, like, what's this dude all about. Okay, so we're 2 chapters through, chapter 3 for tomorrow, and then we'll keep going. Okay?